Hello everybody, this is Neil with Catalyst Machine Works, and I'm going to go through the frame assembly and electronics installation for the Speed Addict 210R. This process also applies to the smaller brother of this frame, the 180. The only difference between the two frames is the length of the arms on the main frame plate, and the fuselage is a little shorter on the 180. But all of the other components are identical. So if you want to assemble your 180, you can look at this video for reference as well. I'd also like to point out that we're going to assemble our 4mm version of this frame. So this is an upgrade that's available on our website, and this gives you a 4mm thick frame plate, which is pretty much indestructible. I dare you to try and break that sucker. It's damn near invincible. Anyway, so I'll go ahead and begin. You start out with your main frame plate, 8 M3 by 8mm screws. Your standoffs, you've got two 32mm long, 4 18mm long, and two 12.5mm long. So I'll go ahead and begin. Okay, so there we go. That's step 1 in the manual. So we'll move on to step 2. Alright, so the next step is to mount the motors to the arms. We're going to be using Xnova's 2204 2300 kV motors. Look at those buttes. So that's the motors there. Also going to be installing these, let's see if I can get it out of there, these little B 20 amp ESCs. So there's a number of ways to do this, and it's a lot of this is just personal preference, but the way we prefer to do it is, see if you can see that, is to cut down the leads from the motors and solder it directly into the board on the ESC. You don't have to do it that way. You can also just, install this as is and then solder these wires to the wires on the motor. But this is just the way we prefer to do it, so this is the way we're going to install it in this video. Okay, I have installed all the prop adapters to the motors, and the next step is to cut down these leads. I'm going to get them to right at 30mm in here. So go ahead and do that now. Okay, so I'm going to measure out the lead here. And I'm going to use an X-Acto knife to mark 30mm. That way I know where to cut it. There we go. Next step is to open up the insulation on each wire. Now, of course, you should be using an insulation stripper, a wire stripper, but I'm going to do it the old school
ghetto way here. I don't happen to have a wire stripper with me, but I'm just going to show this process for one motor, and then obviously you duplicate it for all the motors. You don't need to pull off much insulation, just a little bit. There we go. So that's it. That's what it looks like. So you do that to all your motors. Alright, so we've got all of the wires cut down to 30 millimeters on all the motors, and all the ends, insulation pulled off the very ends of the motors. And now we're going to tin the open wires, meaning we're going to deposit a little bit of solder on these wires. So I'll put a little flux on there. Okay, so that's it. So I'll go ahead and do this to the rest of the motors. Okay, I've tinned all of the leads to the motors here. Next step is to take the speed controller and cut off the insulation. Be real careful when you're doing this so you don't slice your finger. Not my fault if you slice your finger. Alright, get that off there. So we've got the open board here. Take my little grabber and hold this thing down. Next, I'm going to take these wires off of the board. You don't have to apply much heat. You shouldn't be sitting here putting a whole bunch of heat into this. You just that's it. Right? So just get it hot enough and pull it off. You don't have to sit there and bake it. I'm gonna get some more solder on here. My hands are shaking this morning. I have not had breakfast. There we go. And that's it. So we've got the wires removed, and so now we're going to solder on the motor. I'm going to put this back in here. There we go. Our next step is to re-insulate the ESC board. So I'm going to line up my shrink tubing here and cut it. You want to leave some excess so that the wires are nice and insulated, protected. You know, some manufacturers sell different colors of these shrink tubes, so if you want to color coordinate your machine, you can, you know, match red to red or blue or whatever color you want to do. So I'm going to slip this over the board, make sure it's even. Okay, and that is what it looks like when it's done. Well insulated, nice and neat, slick looking installation if you do it this way. Again, this is just personal preference. We think this is the best way to do it, but so I'll go ahead and apply that to the rest of the motors, and then we'll go on to the next step. So one thing I would like to point out is that 30 millimeter distance from here to the end of the wires where we cut it. If you're building the 180, the Speed Addict 180R, you want, you know, obviously the arms are shorter, so this distance is going to be shorter as well. Alright, so the next step is to mount the motor to the main frame plate. Again, this is a 4 millimeter thick frame plate. This is 3 millimeter thick. If you're using the 4 millimeter thick plate, you want to use the motor mount screw by itself, right? So you're not going to add on the washer. And the reason for that is when you run the screw through the plate, you want a certain amount of thread exposed. Okay? So if you are using the 3 millimeter plate, put the washer on there to run it through. So that's giving you the same thread depth here. Okay, now what I've done here is gone ahead and taken some shrink tubing, put it on the arm. That way when I install the motor, I can place this ESC underneath the shrink tubing, heat it up, shrink it down, it holds it in place nice and tight. It's very, very neat setup that way. Now you don't have to do that. You can do it the way I've done it here and just take some double-sided stick tape and put it under the speed controller. So again, that's just personal preference. But for the purposes of this video, this is how we're going to do it. So we'll put this in here and just let it sit in there. Go ahead and run this through. Now I'm still a little shaky. I'm getting I'm getting hangry, which is when you're angry from being hungry. So you're hangry. My brother taught me that one recently. I love it. I think it's something I got to use more often. All right. When I'm making this video, I'm trying to sort of speed things up in each process because I know it can be quite boring to sit and watch somebody do some repetitive task over and over again. Alright, when you torque these things down, make sure they're nice and tight, but don't over torque it. Don't torque the crap out of it. And it's probably a good idea to use Loctite on these. Can't hurt. For the purposes of this video, I'm not doing that, but I suggest to put a little bit of Loctite on there. Alright. So that's in there. Look at that, huh? That looks good. Okay, next what I want to do is shrink the tubing down to hold the speed controller in place. If you do it this way, there's no need to have any stick tape on the bottom of the speed controller. It'll just hold in place nice and tight with this shrink tubing. But one thing to pay attention to is when you're positioning the ESC to shrink it down, watch out for this little hole right here. There is actually a fastener set that runs through there, and you want enough space between it's a nut and the end of the edge of the speed controller. So just make sure there's distance there, right? So I'm going to kind of hold this with my finger, try and not burn my hand off. There we go. That's what that looks like. Alright, so I've got all of the motors and speed controllers installed on the main frame plate. This is what yours is going to look like after you're done. So at this point we're just leaving the power leads and the signal wires uncut and open, and put this aside and we'll move on to the next step. Alright, the next step in the process involves the power distribution board. We sell the 210 and 180 frame with or without this board. I do suggest to go ahead and buy this at the time that you place your order for the frame. You're going to need it. You have to use some sort of power distribution board, and it needs to be of this size and form factor. The only reason I can come up with to not get this is if you already have one. But the frame is designed around this guy, so this is going to work perfectly in your build. First thing we want to do is go ahead and cut some pigtail wires for your lithium battery. Cut these to 55 to 60 millimeters long in here. Get those set up so you can use anywhere from 14 gauge to 12 gauge wires. We've got 14 gauge here, and that is just fine. Get the grommet and get the header pins that come with the board. We've got some header pin holes here that you can connect into. We've got one for the camera, for the video transmitter, and for the OSD. With this build, we're not going to be using an OSD. That is just personal preference. We don't really like OSDs. We don't like the distraction in the goggles, but it's up to you. If you want to use an OSD, feel free. But for the purposes of this video, we're not going to solder in these headers onto the OSD holes here. So we'll go ahead and begin. So we've got 2 rows of 3 here. So I've cut off. We're going to use the right angle pins that come with your board. Alright, so we got 2 of those there. Alright, what you want to do first, before installing these headers, is to choose what voltage you want to run out to your camera and your video transmitter. We're going to be using an HS 1177 camera and also a Hawkeye 200 megawatt video transmitter. This one's the race band version. So these guys are both, it's best to operate them at 12 volt, so that's what we're going to choose. There are tiny little pads that you jump, right? So you put a little spot of solder to jump and choose if you want 12 volt or 5 volt. So we're going to choose 12 volt on both of these and go ahead and solder them. Now these little pads are very tiny, so you need a solder gun like this, a little thin tip This is a Weller. This is a 12 watt little unit. This should work fine. So go ahead. And also we're using no OSD with our setup here. So there's 2 pads for no OSD. So you want to jump those as well. Right, and that's it. I don't know if you can see that, but I just jumped the 2 pads for the OSD. I'm going to go to the video transmitter pads. That's it. I just jumped the pads for the video transmitter. Doesn't take much, just enough solder to make that connection. There we go, that's done. So I'm not sure if the camera's picking up on that. It's pretty small, but that's what it's going to look like. If you have problems with your vision, this spot may be a little bit of trouble, but we'll do that one again here. There we go. Alright, it's time to solder in the headers here. So what I'm going to do is take my flux and dab the ends of the header pins into the flux capacitors. Then we'll start out with the camera, so we'll insert it first. I'm going to go to the back end here. Turn it over. Alright, so we've got the camera soldered. Probably be a better idea if I use this. Let's do that. Makes it a lot easier. Plug these in here. That'll be a whole heck of a lot easier. And if you've never done this before, it's really actually pretty easy. What you do is apply heat to the pin and then put your solder on there and let it run, through the pin and over to the pad. And it'll wick the solder down onto the pad and join the pin to the pad. That's what it looks like. So there we go. That is now set up. Alright, what you want to do next is take these headers and angle them up a bit. The reason for this is once you mount this power distribution board in the frame, it sits down low in a bay underneath the main frame plate, and you want these guys to sort of exit out and go over the frame, which comes up to the edge here. So you can see the angle I've got on these. It's about where you want it. The next thing is to solder in the pigtail wires. So the way that this thing should be oriented is these are pointing to the back, these headers are pointing to the back of the frame, and then the pigtail comes off the right of the board, and you need these to be soldered in straight up. So they need to come straight up like this. So what we'll do, we've got our wires cut. We'll go ahead and strip some of the insulation. Don't strip off very much. Like this. There we go. Go ahead and put some flux on here. I'm tinning the end of these. Prepare them to be soldered onto the board. Alright. What we want to do is solder these to these two interior pads. You've got positive here in the front and negative. So we'll take these this first pad, put some solder on it. I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit of a little bit of flux. There we go. All right. So all right, that's what that should look like. So we're coming straight off the board. Okay, we want to take a little bit of insulation here. Cut some of this off. And shrink this down over this connection. Let's see how much I should get. Cut it down a little bit more. There we go. And so what this is doing is protecting these open connections here, and then the wires, protects the wires from the side of the frame. You can see how it comes up next to the frame. So carbon fiber is conductive. You don't want anything shorting out. But, that's what that looks like. Take this grommet. This is a very important part. Before you put on the XT60 connectors on the top, take the grommet and run it down over the wires. You can see how this works. Is this grommet holds this pigtail in place, so you have a nice, clean, and protected set of wires coming off of your battery. So if you don't put this on here and you solder on your XT60, you're going to have to desolder it. That's a big pain in the butt. Now, I happen to have run out of XT60 connectors, so I imagine that I have soldered that on there. That would be the next step. You'll see that later in this build when I have some time today to go out and get some connectors. I'll put it on, but that's it. All right, now we want to take and join this power distribution board to the main frame. We've got these plastic screws, the standoffs, and these little spacers to separate the board from the carbon fiber. So first thing we do is take these screws and put them through the holes. What's nice about these little spacers is they're actually like a press fit over these screws, so they hold in place by themselves while you're doing this. Makes it nice. To readjust my blue gloves. Alright. So you just run it up through the bottom. And there we go. That's what that looks like. You can see they're separated from the main board. Alright, so we go ahead and put these on. Alright, I'm going to tighten these things down. You don't need to over tighten these, just these are plastic screws, keep in mind, so just make sure they're nice and snug and knock it back out. So just a little bit of torque on these screws. There you go. Alright, so the next step in the process is probably the most important step. You need to really take your time. It has to do with soldering these ESC leads to the power distribution board. Right, so what you want to do is cut these things down to the proper length and route them as you see fit and solder them to the pads, the positive and negative pads on this power distribution board. Now, you know, you could just leave these things uncut and just solder them right to it, but now you've got these long wires, which that doesn't make any sense. The opposite end of the spectrum would be to cut them too short, and then once you've got them soldered in, it's pulling on these wires and possibly short out against this carbon fiber. So you don't want to do that. So make sure and cut them to the right length. What you want is that they're routed in where they need to go, and there's a little bit of slack on these, right? So they're wired and routing through, but there's a little bit of slack. But yet at the same time, you've got a nice, neat installation. So off camera, I'm going to go ahead and route mine where they should go. I'm going to cut these wires and leave them all unsoldered, and then I'll solder them in each one by one on camera. Okay, so I have cut all of my ESC wires down to size and routed them. You know, routed them first and then cut them down. What I'm going to do is solder these in one by one, going by the first speed controller here. These are numbered. If you look at your flight controller instructions, it'll say that this is motor 1, motor 2, motor 3, and motor 4. So we'll start with number 1, and the way that I routed this is I've got these are negative pads here, so I've got this guy coming in straight into these pads right there. Then the positive wire is looping around this standoff, going around the back side of this pigtail, and then soldering into these pads over here, which are the positive pads. Now, I forgot to mention in the previous step that it's probably a good idea to go ahead and lay down some solder preemptively on all of these pads. Even if you forgot, like I did, you can go ahead and do it now. I put some flux, I took a little tool and put some flux on the pad so it'll accept solder nice and easily. But we'll go ahead and solder some flux onto those pads now. we got on the 12-volt accessory pads. So you want to be careful when you do all this, that you don't melt these standoffs if you need. You know, if you go to one side of the board together, one cord together, you can take off, get a standoff, you can take your melt thing. Okay, so we've got solder on all the pads. So they're ready to accept some wires. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and solder down the power wires for ESC1. Now what I like to do is take some tweezers and use one hand to sort of manipulate and hold it down, and then use the other to solder it in. Get some more solder in here. There we go. All right, we're going to get the positive wire, and we'll do it this way. Okay, so we've got ESC1 soldered to the board. You can see how I've got this this wire routed. There's plenty of slack here, but not too much. And then we've got this one running around the back side. We also have some slack here, but not too much. You can see soldered into this pad. When you're doing this for all these ESCs, you want to be very cognizant of where your solder and your wire is in reference to this main frame plate, because again, carbon fiber is conductive, so as long as it's not touching, you're okay. It can be close, and that's fine, but if it's touching, you're going to have a short. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go for ESC2. And what I'm going to do to make this easier on myself is take off the standoff here in the corner where we're going to be soldering. That makes it, you know, opens up some space. I don't have the chance of burning that plastic. All right, we're going to get the negative wire. Sorry. I'm going to put my standoff back in. Okay, this is what it looks like. All right, so let's see, I lost track. 1, 2. We're talking about this one. So I just soldered it in. You can see where the positive is running, and then we're going around this standoff, coming around the back, and we're soldering to this set of pads over here. All right, we're going to go ahead and solder in ESC motor number 3. Start with the negative wire. There we go. That guy's soldered in there. Do the positive wire. Okay, so there we have it. Looks pretty good. We'll go on to the next.
Okay, we'll solder in the final speed controller motor. This is number 4. What I'm going to do, pause it, this one, take off the standoff. There we go. So there we have it. We've got them all soldered in. Go ahead and put the standoff back on there. So it's not hard to do. It just takes a little time and patience and planning beforehand. And that's what it should look like. So after you have soldered everything in, go through and double check and make sure that you've got these on the right polarity and that you haven't switched anything so you don't blow out any of your speed controllers. But that is what it should look like when it is complete. Very nice. Okay, it is a good idea at this step to go ahead and cut down these speed controller signal wires. These are going to be running over to your flight controller. Now again, you can leave this length if you want, but you're going to have some excess wire and it may not be ideal. They may be running, you know, and be a sloppy build. I like to get things nice and neat. So the way that you do this is to mount up your flight controller. So this one happens to be a CC3D flight controller. I like these, so I'm going to use this in the build, but you may want to go for a different one. You know, it's up to you. Maybe a Naze 32 Acro or a Seriously Dodo from Ready Made RC. That's a really nice one. So mount this thing up so that the USB input is opposite the LiPo pigtail, so that they're, you know, out of the way of each other. And then that's going to determine where your input pin headers are. And that is how you'll know how long these need to be. So you kind of imagine you route them to these pin headers. The pin headers should be coming out on the bottom of the board, right? So we're going to have right angle pin headers coming out on the bottom of the board. And that way, these signal wires route underneath the board. All of the wiring is hidden under here, nice and tidy. Now, you don't have to do it that way. We even mentioned this in our manual. If you want to go and find your own standoffs, you can use all the way down to 6mm long standoffs that pulls this flight controller down. Then you can take your pin headers, put them on top of the board, and then run the signal wires to the top of the board. And that gets everything down. And you know, you could even go and then you've got room to place your video transmitter right above the flight controller. And that gives you a little more room for that. Anyway, so with this setup, we'll place this on here, and I am going to figure out how long these need to be. I'm not going to cut these on camera. I think that that's not necessary. You guys probably know how to do that. So I'll route them, cut them, solder them, and when we're back, these will be cut to length. So I've got all of the speed controller signal wires cut down to size. You can see them here. I'm going to go ahead and twist these guys up. There we go. Alright, the next step is to take and install the power distribution board bay. This is the shroud, I guess you'd call it, that
that covers up this board and protects it from the elements and crashes and moisture, things like that. So what you want to do is take these little aluminum inserts and just press them into the bores on this, on this plastic part. It's supposed to be a press fit, so you may need to use a tool to press them in there. I didn't have to this time. Alright, so position this like so. That should surround the power distribution board. Take this carbon fiber plate and snap it in like that. Take these are M3 by I believe 16 millimeter. Run those up through. Okay. There we go. And then proceed to install the little M3 nuts on there. What I'm going to do is I need to get these nuts together, snug, and then I'll come back and tighten them all down later. Okay, I've gotten those all on there. Now off camera I'm going to go back and tighten these things down. Make sure they're tight, but again, you don't need to crank the crap out of them. Just tighten them up where it makes sense. That's what that looks like. Okay, the next step is to install your receiver. So the receiver is mounted in the rear of the fuselage here, and this one that we're using here is a D4R2. This is a very popular receiver from FR Sky. I use it with my Tyrannus. Anyway, so what we want to do is get a little double-sided stick tape. Measure it up. See how much you want to cut off. This stuff that I'm using here is phenomenal. This is it's made by 3M, and it's a clear silicone stick tape, and I really like it. I use it for everything. So you might want to pick some of that up. I find it at Lowe's. Go ahead and cut this. Go. Okay, now whenever you mount this receiver in here, you want to mount it so you're pushed up, not touching these two standoffs, but almost. And just press it down. Okay, make sure that it's lined up.
that your antenna leads are coming out the back. And there we go. The next step is to mount the FPV video transmitter to the bottom of this fuselage plate. So the bottom of the fuselage plate is in this orientation when the little hole for the grommet and the XT60 connectors go into your left. And we're going to mount this thing such that it is sitting centered on this plate, but just behind these two little holes here. Those two holes match up to these two standoffs. So when this thing is positioned in here, you don't want it to hit these. So be cognizant of where it's actually mounted when you're doing it. But we'll go ahead and install it now. So get some more stick tape here. I should take out stock in this company. I use so much stick tape. It's pretty ridiculous. There we go. I'm going to start buying stick tape in bulk. Okay, so we'll install this guy right about there. See where I've got it installed. Next, we want to take the pigtail and round it around. And I want to point out that you see in this plate that there's a hole right here. On our production version, we just have the hole in the back. There's no hole right here, so just want to confuse anybody. There we go. That routes through this hole like this. Put these washers and this nut on. There we go. Now this is soft brass, so it's probably a good idea to use a proper, open face wrench. I've got an adjustable here. It's a little awkward with this wrench, but it'll get the job done eventually. Okay. Tighten it down a little bit more. There we go. So that's what that looks like. Now you'll notice that this pigtail is kind of flapping in the wind, so what we'll do is take a zip tie, and we've got the word speed written in here, which is super cool, if I do say so myself, and run the zip tie through the D and around. There we go. Just like that. Okay, there we have it. So that'll hold it in place, this little zip tie. Everything's nice and neat, looks good, well protected. So your connections will run into here and then run on down to the power distribution board and over to the camera. Alright, it is time to install the flight controller, but beforehand we've got to solder on the pin headers to this thing. Now I'm doing a stock install, obviously, so with a stock install of this flight controller, You're going to use these included standoffs, and as you can see, when you put the flight controller down, you want these headers to be underneath, right? So these are right angle headers, and they usually come in a long strip like this. So I broke off six rows of them and put them through the holes, and then proceed to solder all of these pins to these pads. Now, I showed you how to do it in a previous step, so I'm not going to sit here on camera and bore you to death soldering all of these things, but just to reiterate, to go over it again, the way that you do it is to apply heat to the pin and to the pad at the same time, and then take your solder and press it onto the pin, and it will wick that solder down and join the two together. And so I'll go ahead and solder these off camera and be back. Alright, I've got the pin headers soldered onto the board, so that's what it looks like afterwards. Now the next step is to go ahead and prepare all of your wiring coming into the flight controller. Now, you know, this is going to be slightly different for each flight controller, so I can't speak for all of them right now, but they're all pretty much the same. You know, you've got your signals coming in from the ESCs into the flight controller into these pin headers here, and so you've got motor 1, 2, 3, and 4. The next thing is, in this particular board, you have got this one. This is positive and negative. This is the power that runs over to your receiver. So this runs over to your receiver to power it. And then this far one over here, this little wire, is the signal wire for CCPM. And this one wire runs over to the signal on this receiver. Now obviously this is different for every board, but you know, if you're running CCPM over to your receiver, you're going to have 3 wires. You're going to have the positive, the negative, and the signal. Now next you have to get power from this power distribution board over to the flight controller to power it. So this particular flight controller will run from, I think it's 5.8 volts all the way up to 15 volts, which is pretty cool. So what we're going to do is pick 12 volts. So on this power distribution board we've got a filtered 12 volt pad right here. So you want to use filtered power so you don't get any voltage spikes. Speed controllers can create voltage spikes, so you don't want that. If it's filtered, you won't have any problems. So that's what we'll do. So we'll run from, this is the power into the board. This last set of pins here, it says positive and negative. We have a servo wire that runs over there to these pads, right? So I will go ahead and connect all of that stuff up, and I'll show you after it's done what it looks like. Okay, for this section, this step rather, I'm going to manipulate and modify this plug. Now obviously this is only going to pertain to people who run the CC3D, so if you're running a Naze 32 or a Dodo or whatever else, you can just ignore this and skip ahead to the next step. So what we want to do with this this plug is we want to section off and have just these 2 wires, and then this wire as well. So these in the middle we can take out. So what I can actually do is very carefully take my X-Acto knife and pull back these little tabs. Oops. Alright, so pull back that tab and pull out these wires that we don't need. Okay, so there's one. So I'll go ahead and speed up the film now so you don't have to be bored out of your mind.
I'm going to go ahead and pull all of these out. Okay, that's what it looks like. So we've got what we want. This one on the far end is the signal. This is the power and the ground. Now we need to take out we need to actually take out all of these. Like so. There we go. We've got this one here. Actually, I need to verify which goes where. Look at that. I've got one of my builds here, so it looks like the positive wire is going in the middle of the plug. Okay, so we had it right. There we go. So I modified that plug. That's nice. So where that thing's going to run to is going to go from here over to channel 1, over to channel 1 on the receiver. So that is taken care of. The next thing we need to do is make up a cable that is going to run from pin header 6, these headers here, over to the 12-volt pads. Okay, so what I've done to get power over to this board is I've got a little servo plug here, and it's running into number 6. It's going to go over to 12-volt pads. So I'm going to go ahead and solder those in now. Let's see, I've decided that black is going to be negative and white is going to be positive. So the center pad on this board is negative. So we will position this. Get my tweezers here. Here we go. So now we're going to have 12-volt filtered power running over to our flight controller. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is run the power and the signal from the video transmitter over to these headers on the power distribution board. So we've got one here for your FPV video transmitter. Now,
what this unit comes with are these cables, right? So you've got power here. This is the plug for power. So it plugs in right here. See if I can get it plugged in. I tell you, it is always harder to do this on camera than in real life for some reason. But there we go. Maybe it's because I have these obstructive gloves on. I don't know. That might be part of it. And so that's plugged in, and then this plug plugs in here. All right, so we've got all of these extra wires that we don't need. The only one that we need is this one right here and these right there. So what I'm going to do is run these over to a plug like this, and then plug that into the power distribution board. So what we're going to do on this connector here is get rid of all these wires we don't need, leaving the one that we do need, which is the signal. So I'm going to go ahead with an X-Acto knife and pull these things out. I'll speed up the footage. It's a little bit tedious, but somebody's got to do it. There we go. That one's good to go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to cut this thing to length, right? So we're going to figure out about how long this should be, and then we'll connect these to a little servo plug. All right, so what I have done is made a plug that runs from the video transmitter over to the power distribution board. I've used the existing, I guess you call it cabling, that comes with the video transmitter. So how it works is this this little plug here plugs in to the video transmitter power and ground, and they've made these things so tiny that it's tricky to get them plugged in, but there we go. And then the other one, this is the signal, plugs in there. That's how that works. And I've soldered them up to a standard servo connector that then plugs into the video transmitter headers on the power distribution board. So that's how that thing works. So yours should look like this once you're done. Before we install the top plate onto the craft, what we want to do is set up our cable for the FPV camera. So the cable that comes with this camera has got positive, negative, and signal. So it plugs in like so. There we go. But obviously that's a bit lengthy for our setup. So what we need to do is cut this thing down. We're running to these headers here in the power distribution board. It's going to plug right in there. So you can kind of place the camera about where it should be and then figure out, you know, how short you need to cut these wires to. So I'm going to do that off screen and modify this cable, and when we come back you'll see what it looks like. Here is the cable. I've cut it down to size, and so it's going to plug in right here into the FPV camera headers, just like this. And I went ahead and decided to bend these headers to the forward of the craft. I accidentally cut this guy a little bit too short,
So it's no problem. These headers are actually pretty flexible. They won't break unless you bend them multiple times. So I bent this towards the front of the craft. Now I've got plenty of cable length here. So this is going to plug in like so, and this will be situated like this in the bird. So go ahead and take this out. I also wanted to take this time to introduce a guy who never leaves my side, my Vader coffee cup. He's been with me through thick and thin, many cups of coffee. He helps me out on these builds. Thank you, Vader. I'm going to install the flight controller and all the various wires running to it. So the first thing we want to do is figure out which motors are which. So which are signified as, or designated as 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then plug those in to the corresponding headers on this flight controller. So this is motor 1, 2, 3, and 4 according to the CCD or CC3D manual. All right, so motor 1 we're going to plug into number 1. Motor 2 goes to number 2, and so on. There we go. So we've got all the speed controllers plugged in. Now we're going to get this cable that's coming off of our 12 volt pads on the power distribution board over to power this flight controller. So that goes in the last headers there. Okay, so next I'm going to go ahead and plug in the FPV cable for the camera. So this goes like so, come in this way. Make sure I'm setting this up so you guys can see this. There we go. Alright, so we've got all that plugged in. Looks kind of like a hot mess right now with it all open like that. Alright, next we're going to get the this big plug on the side, and this one plugs over to the receiver. So I'm going to make sure and get the signal cable. So the signal cable is this one on the far side. Okay. So this is going to plug right in to here. There we go. There we have it. There we go. So what I'll do is take my little M3 nuts here. Now when you're doing this yourself, you may want to take some more time and sort of route these wires and whatnot underneath, and maybe use some zip ties and do some wire management. I'm not doing that for the purposes of this video, just so you guys aren't bored, but you get the idea. So after I'm done filming, I'm going to go back in and make sure that everything's nice and tidy underneath this flight controller when I button it up. Okay. So that's what that looks like. So now we've got this
this cable for your camera open and ready to accept the camera, and we can go ahead and put on the top plate. One thing I would suggest before installing your top plate and buttoning this thing up is to figure out which direction the motors are spinning and correct as needed. So what you want to do is provide power to the system and give input to these motors either through clean flight or base flight or whatever you're using, or Libre Pilot in the case of this flight controller, and or through your transmitter. See which direction these are spinning, and if you've got one or a few of them that are going the wrong direction, you take this flight controller and take the nuts off, open it up, and then plug these speed controllers into BL Heli, into the software for these speed controllers, and you can change the direction of their rotation in the software. So obviously you don't want to change their direction by resoldering these wires. That'd be a big pain in the butt. So go ahead and change the direction as needed. Then you can put your flight controller back on and proceed. Your next step is to take the battery strap that comes with your kit, install it onto this top fuselage plate. It runs through these two slots on either side of the plate. Make sure you've got the strap oriented in the correct direction so that whenever you connect it together around your battery, you've got the company name positioned on the outside of the strap. So that's what it should look like. Now that this is on, you can go ahead and install your plate onto the main frame. To install the top plate, you're going to need these two M3 by 6mm button head screws. We're going to attach the top fuselage plate to the main frame. And before you do that, you want to make sure and plug in the video transmitter into the correct headers on the power distribution board. I've done this here already, so that's ready to go. And make sure your wires are routed correctly. There we go. So you want to line it up and then take these little button head M3 screws, don't use too much torque on these screws. Just get them nice and snug. Next, change out my driver. Put in these set screws. So these are 10mm long set screws. These are M3. And these go into these standoffs in the front here. You want to leave about 4mm of thread exposed here so it can accept the other standoff. There you go. And I suggest use Loctite on these screws. I'm not going to do it in this video, but it is a good idea. Alright, go ahead and install the standoffs. That's what that looks like. You use a wrench to make sure they're tight. There we go. In this step, we're going to take the FPV camera. This is your HS1177 camera. Remove these two screws that hold the back plate on, like so. And when you do this, and you take the back plate off, keep the camera oriented like this. This board with the sensor will fall out. So you don't want that to happen. So just put the plate back, take this little adjustment mount that comes in your kit, place it over the top, and then you've got these little screws that come with your kit. These are number 2 standard little sheet metal screws. Actually, they work perfect for plastic. And replace the stock screws with these modified screws. These are longer screws so they can bite into the material. All right, you don't need to over torque it, just get it snug, because keep in mind you're running into plastic. And there we go. Perfect. That's what it looks like when you're done. All right, we've made some great progress. So we want to make sure, once we've got this top plate on, to go ahead and install the grommet into this little hole in the side of the plate. Take these 2 wires and twist them so they're oriented like this. And I didn't get a chance yet to go and get a XT60 connector, but you can just imagine for a minute that it's soldered in there. So I apologize for that. Ran out of time yesterday. Alright, so the next step is to go ahead and plug in this this camera. Right? So we've got it plugged in there. Then what you want to do is take these 2 little camera mount plates. Make sure you've got them oriented correctly to where this little arc is sitting towards the rear of the craft, and these holes, these big holes, are at the top. Alright, so just kind of line them up in here. Set them in here like this. Then on the side of your camera you'll see these little nubs here, little circles. Line those up with the 2 holes in these plates. You can kind of compress these 2 plates together, hold it in place, then take and position the top plate on. There we go. And just leave it, it'll sit there like this. Alright, get my driver. These are M3 by 10 millimeter screws. Make sure it's nice and tight. Okay. And you see whenever you tighten this down, the plate is actually sitting up, it's sort of angled upwards. That's why it's nice whenever you crank down the last 2 screws, it compresses these side plates. Okay. Keeps everything nice and joined together. There you should be. There you go. And there we have it. That's what that looks like when you're done. So now you're going to notice on this camera I've got in here that this lens seems to be bigger, most likely, than the lens you got on your camera. And the reason for that is that I chose this wide-angle lens to install into my camera. That's all just personal preference. If you use the lens that comes with these things, usually the lens sits a little bit farther back, so it's better protected. So keep that in mind. If you want to use a wide-angle lens like this, it's going to sit out a little bit in front of the camera cage. So you'll notice that this thing has enough resistance on it that you can orient the camera in the angle that you want. And what you can do is go out and fly with this and figure out which angle you like. And then once you determine which angle you want to fly with, you can take these little number 4 size screws that come in your kit, and you can go ahead and lock it down. So there's little holes in the side of this mount that will allow you to keep this camera at a set angle. There we go. And when you're screwing these in, you don't have to put a whole lot of torque into this. Just make sure that it compresses the camera side plate such that it holds the camera in place. And that sucker is not going to move. There you go, that's how that goes together. Alright, we're down to the last steps here with this build. So this involves the antenna mount for your receiver. So what you want to do is take the antenna tubes and press them into these bores here that hold the antenna tubes in. Alright. Don't need to use any glue or anything like that to hold them in. There's enough compression that they're not going to come out once you get them in there. Might help to take and push them down on a table, make sure they're nice and tight in there. Okay, so that's what that looks like. There you go. Then you have two little collars. These are 5mm long aluminum collars. Press those into these two bores here. Alright. Position this in the rear of the craft. Alright. And these are M3 by 12mm screws. I'm going to run these down and then into the standoffs. There we go. Now, you got your antennas. Run these one by one up through these tiny little holes in the bottom. They should just push through nice and easy. There we go. That's what that looks like. Okay. Now, these don't come with your kit, but I imagine you have these. This is just shrink tubing used for electrical wiring. And my little trick is to take and bend these over, position these like this. There we go. Now this antenna mount is really awesome because it it's made of TPU, so it's flexible. So when you crash, these things are going to flex around instead of bending and breaking. All right, so the final step is to install your antenna, your FPV antenna. There we go. Obviously this isn't included in your kit, so that's your personal preference, which you go with. And there we have it. Voila! So again, this assembly process applies to not only the 210, which we have here, but the 180, the 180R. Exact same assembly process. Now, with your battery, what I like to do, and this works out really, really well, is to take some Velcro, put it on your battery, and then put a strip here on the craft. Mount it in. It's best to mount it in this orientation. And on our assembly manual, there is a picture showing how you route how you route the wiring, and then connect it into the XT60 connector to keep all of the wiring outside of the line of the prop, so you don't chop up your pigtail here. But there we go. I hope this was helpful, and if anybody has any questions, anything that we didn't review in this video, feel free to email us at info@catalystmachineworks.com. We're not going to go over software setup. That's not in the scope of this video, but I believe there's plenty of information out there on how to set up the various components here in their software packages. We've got some information on our site how to get into BL Heli and change settings on these speed controllers. And so there you go.